It had snowed for 6 endless days. Heavy, slow-moving flakes drifted down like fallen prayers, wrapping the vast prairie in a white shroud. The fences, once sharp and proud, now bent under the weight, looking like crooked ghosts of their former selves. The wind sang through the gaps of the wooden ranch house, scraping across the windows as if trying to get in. But inside, the air was still, except for the steady snap of firewood breaking in the stone hearth. The lantern burned like it always did. Dim, golden, patient, Elias Boone lit it every evening without fail. The same way he brushed the dust from his saddle or ran his fingers through his mare's mane. The same way he carved the names of cattle long dead into the barn posts, not from habit, from loyalty, because once years ago someone had waited for him by that same light. And though that someone now rested under the cottonwoods out past the ridge, his promise hadn't been buried with her. The snow had cut the world off, no wagon tracks, no riders. Even the crows had flown south, leaving only the whisper of wind. So when Elias saw 2 dark shapes moving across the white, he thought at first his eyes were playing tricks, maybe wolves, he figured. But then one stumbled, and the other caught her. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the storm. The figures were human barefoot, wrapped in what looked like deer hide and thin, worn shawls. They stopped at the edge of his yard, hesitating. The snow swirled around them, biting at their faces. Elias didn't move. The lantern beside him swung on its hook, the light flickering across his weathered face. He raised one hand, not a welcome, not a warning either, just enough to say, "You're seen." The older girl nodded, cautious, and guided the younger toward the barn. Elias opened the door, and they slipped inside. He didn't follow right away. He just stood there, boots buried in snow, staring into the endless white behind them, half expecting to see a shadow, a pursuer, some danger trailing close, but there was nothing, only wind, only silence. Inside the barn, the smell of wet hides, straw, and old smoke filled the air. The 2 girls huddled close to a cow that shifted uneasily but didn't protest. Elias set a tin cup of coffee near them and said nothing. He wasn't sure if they spoke English. The older one took the cup. Her hands were cracked and bleeding, but steady. A faint scar ran through her bottom lip, pale against her brown skin. Her eyes didn't plead. They studied him. She didn't thank him, but she didn't spill the coffee either. When he turned to go, the younger one, barely more than a child, whispered something in a tongue he couldn't understand. The older girl didn't translate that night. He left the house door unlatched, and though the fire burned warm, Elias couldn't sleep. He just sat in the rocker by the hearth, carving a cedar stick down to nothing while the storm howled outside. Each crack of the fire made him think he heard that same faint whisper again, the one from the barn. By dawn, the storm had softened. When Elias opened the door, the girls were standing on the porch, half frozen, heads bowed. He didn't speak, just stepped aside. They entered slowly. It took hours for their trembling to stop. He noticed then the younger one limped slightly. The older girl helped her to the only chair and sat cross-legged on the floor beside her. Elias boiled beans and gave them what bread he had. They ate carefully, almost formally, not desperate, not greedy, like they'd known hunger too long to show it anymore. He still didn't ask questions. That night he lay awake again, the wind pressing against the windows like a restless spirit. But it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded alive. By the next morning, the younger girl's fever broke. Elias went out to chop wood, and when he returned, the older one had washed her sister's hair, hung the wet cloths to dry, and cleaned the hearth. He leaned in the doorway, watching silently. When she noticed him, she didn't flinch. She stood, wiped her hands, and finally spoke. "Nahina," she said quietly. He blinked. She pointed toward the girl by the fire. "Tanny." He nodded once. "Elias." She tried repeating it, stumbling at first. "Elias," then smiled slightly. "Eli." That name seemed to fit better. Later that day, when Elias saddled his mare to ride into town for supplies, Nahina followed him halfway to the gate. The snow was falling again, light and steady. "You come back?" she asked. He looked at her, the lantern light still echoing in his eyes. "I light it every night," he said simply. She tilted her head. "Why?" He said nothing, just mounted and rode away. The general store in Clay Hollow was colder than the prairie, not by weather but by stairs. Clovis Hatch, the blacksmith, leaned close as Elias walked past. "You know who they are, Boone." Elias said nothing. Clovis spat on the floor. "Comanche, maybe, or traded girls. Best let the sheriff handle it. Dangerous either way." Elias kept his voice calm. "You talk too much for a man with cold hands." Clovis sneered. "Just saying, some debts ain't worth paying." Elias bought flour, salt, beans, and a tin of cherry tobacco. The shopkeeper eyed him curiously. "Expecting company?" "Depends how long the snow holds," Elias replied, and left. When he returned, Nahina was waiting by the gate again. She didn't ask what he'd bought, just took the tin of tobacco and tucked it away gently as though it were something holy. That evening, Elias noticed the curtain in his main room had been mended, not replaced, just sewn carefully, small tight stitches, done by someone who'd once known comfort and wanted to remember it. He said nothing, but that night he left his late wife's blue shawl hanging by the door. The next morning, Nahina wore it. The color was faded, but it made her look almost like a memory come to life. She stirred beans while Elias split wood. Tawny read from an old, torn-up primer he didn't remember owning. The cabin felt less empty. For the first time in years, he lingered near the table just to hear another voice breathing in rhythm with his own. That night, after Tanny fell asleep, Nahina stepped outside. The snow hissed softly against the roof. She stood bare-shouldered on the porch, letting the flakes melt against her skin. The blue shawl clung to her like an old promise. Elias joined her quietly. "You quiet," she said without turning. "So are you," he answered. She smiled faintly. "This place safe?" He hesitated. "It's far from most things, safer than many." She turned toward him, her eyes catching the lantern's glow. "You alone long time?" 12 winters, he said. She nodded slowly. "I remember fire, our old home, mother's voice, deer stew, then guns, men, not kin." Her breath caught. "My uncle traded us for bullets." Elias said nothing. His jaw tightened. "But you didn't ask," she said softly. "I've seen too much to stare," he replied. She touched his hand gently. "You think we stay?" He didn't answer, not in words, but that night he left the door unlatched again. 3 days later, the snow stopped. The sun came out sharp and pale, like a blade through clouds. Elias was mending a gate post when the sheriff rode in. Sheriff Arlen Crow wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't one for kindness either. "Town's uneasy," Crow said, stepping down from his horse. "Word is you're keeping 2 native girls here." Elias didn't blink. "They're not prisoners. They're guests." The sheriff looked toward the porch where Nahina stood, quiet but unafraid. "You claiming her?" Elias's jaw tightened. "I ain't sending her out there." That's not what I asked. He met the sheriff's eyes. She's mine. Crow studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then make it proper, before someone else tries to. He mounted his horse and rode off. Elias turned. Nahina had stepped down from the porch, snow crunching beneath her feet. Your law, she said softly, says marry. He nodded. It does. She untied the blue shawl from her neck and held it out. Then you give this to me again, she said, like man gives gift. Elias took it slowly, trembling just a little. He tied it around her neck again, this time with care, with meaning. They didn't speak of love, but in that small, quiet gesture, in the breath between them, it lived. That night, the lantern glowed brighter than it ever had. Elias sat beside Nahina while she rested her head on his shoulder. Tani slept under a quilt by the fire outside. The wind no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like home. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade like smoke. Tap, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Would you have opened your door to strangers on a snowy night? Your thoughts keep this frontier spirit alive. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, click hype below to support the channel, so the fire stays lit and more Wild West souls find their way home. Because sometimes the quietest stories echo the loudest across time.